You can see some real genuine anger. Both sides knew there would be a tussle. And so like people showed up in hockey helmets and bicycle helmets and stuff, armor and baseball gloves. And, there's certainly that game-like aspect. But when you saw the exchange between Lin Shufan and the KMT legislator, the KMT slapped her and then the Lin Shufan hit her with a right hook and nearly knocked her out. And, you don't mess with these guys from Zhanghua. That's just not smart.
You're listening to Talking Taiwan with your host, Felicia Lin.
After fights broke out in Taiwan's Yuan, or Legislative Yuan, on May 17th, sending several legislators to the hospital, the public gathered in protest outside of the Legislative Yuan in Taipei. There have been over 30,000, 100,000, and 70,000 people gathered at 3 of the major protests, which are being called the Bluebird movement. The name is a play on the name of the road nearby the Legislative Yuan, where protests began. I spoke with Taipei Times columnist Michael Turton and his son Sebastian on May 27th about the controversial bills that have caused such widespread dissent. Sebastian shared what he saw at the protests in Taipei on Tuesday, May 22nd and Friday, May 24th. I also spoke with Sean Su after a set of the controversial legislative reform bills passed on May 28th. There have been protests all over Taiwan in 15 different cities and even globally. The New York Bluebird, a group of politically conscious New York City-based Taiwanese, have teamed up with Keep Taiwan Free to raise funds for a billboard in New York's Times Square to promote awareness of the Bluebird movement. The billboard will appear on Tuesday, June 4th at 6 p.m. Without further ado, here's our episode. Welcome to the podcast, guys.
Thank you. Thank you for this opportunity.
According to reports, all this started around Friday, May 17th. There were some bills that were being introduced in the Yuan that people are having some problems with this. So can you just, for our audience, explain what happened and why it's led to all these protests around the Yuan?
I guess I'll take that question. There's several parts to these bills. The one that's drawn out the protesters is the one that will give the legislature the power to subpoena anyone, basically. It's specifically aimed at government officials, but it includes anyone. And if you lie to them, if they perceive that you lie to them, in the original form of the bill, if they perceive that you lie to them, they could just send you off to jail and fine you. And it still has fines for government officials. And government officials may actually need to lie, especially if they're talking about sensitive areas or, weapons development or something like that, relations with other countries. But there's nothing to stop them from calling, say, a journalist and asking them who their sources were, or tossing a journalist they don't like in jail for possibly lying to them. That was somewhat ameliorated in the second reading of the bill, where they added language that would be sent to the control yuan, because that was particularly objectionable. But there's also a line in there that says you can't reverse question the legislature. So if someone asks you a question, you can't just say, "Why are you asking me this question?" Or you can't answer with a sarcastic question of your own or any of that. And apparently, because they asked them, well, what does this mean? And the KMT said, well, we'll explain it after the bill is passed. So there's this issue that the fear is that, of course, the KMT is aligned with the Communist Party of China. They're working together. Ma Ying-jeou was just there a couple months ago. The powerful members of the KMT have visited China several times in the last few months. It's obvious that they're working together. And if you were China, you could be using this in many different ways to find out what's going on in Taiwan, to disrupt the Lai government, just constantly having its people called in to be subpoenaed before the legislature. You remember back in 2008 when Ma Ying-jeou was first elected, that one of the first things he did was indict a whole bunch of DPP politicians. And he did this so that they would be bogged down in trials for the next year in the run-up to the election. And of course they would have this aura about their name, well, he's been indicted. So another goal here would be to smear DPP politicians and to place them under a cloud. So that's what is bothering people, the link between the KMT and the Chinese Communist Party, and the ability of a legislature armed with these amendments to completely disrupt the functioning of the government.
Yeah, the timing is very interesting because as you said, Ma Ying-jeou has visited China, and then there was like several high-level Kuomintang officials that visited it, and then now we're having these bills being introduced. But I do have a question because some people say that some version of these types of bills have been introduced by the DPP in the past, and they're saying this is a little bit hypocritical. And what can you say about that? Is there some difference in what the DPP was proposing in terms of the legislative yuan's expanded power?
The DPP says there's a difference. All of the DPP politicians maintain that there is. And offhand, I don't remember anything about reverse questioning in the DPP proposals. And the DPP proposal, I think that's why they added the control yuan amendment, that where they send the case to the control yuan. The U.S. does a similar thing. Actually, the U.S. Congress has the power to simply imprison people who they don't feel are being forthright. But they almost never use it. The last time it was used was like 80 years ago. Now the custom is to transfer those cases to the local prosecutor. But so those people who say that this is like the U.S. one are being disingenuous. But at this point, all of the DP politicians have said the same thing. Look, this is not our bill. The DPP politicians have all said that this bill is different and much worse than the one that they proposed. And the people who have been defending this are not actually saying differently. They're not putting up the two bills side by side and saying, look, they're exactly the same. They could easily do that, but they're not. So it strikes me, the whole conversation, plus a lot of the conversation around this says, well, it's something the legislature needs, but no one defending this ever mentions the KMT's close connections to the CCP. They attempt to poo-poo that, right? Oh, it's not going to happen. There's nothing like that. How could you possibly fear that? There's no evidence that the CCP's hand is in this, well, except for the last 20 years of cooperation between the two parties, between the two sides.
But why isn't the DPP trying to put the bills side by side and say, look, our bill is not the same as this one that's being proposed?
There's stuff out there like that.
I did see a graph on Twitter comparing the two bills. It was submitted by a DPP legislator on Twitter. I forgot his name.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Maybe it was Puma Shin.
So the information is out there. Yeah.
And Sebastian, what are your thoughts on this? You've been participating in the protests around the Li Yuan. Why are you showing up there, and what have you seen while you've been there?
Let's see. I went there first on Tuesday, and I felt driven to come out because I think there is a lot of people who are okay on paper with the idea of reforming the Li Yuan, but the way the KMT and the TPP are doing it is not what we want, and some of the language is too vague. And it concerns a lot of people, especially progressive activists. They feel like they'll be targeted next. At the protests on Tuesday and on Friday, last Tuesday and Friday, I saw lots of progressive groups out, like the groups that support gay rights in Taiwan, groups that support fair wages. I saw them there. I even saw members of the Obasang party there, and that gave me a chuckle. And for the Tuesday protest, it was much smaller than later on Friday. And it was mostly young, if I had to say. Lots of high schoolers who just got off. I saw some of them in their uniforms. And the thing that struck me the most with the protests was that it doesn't feel very organized. It doesn't feel like it was mobilized. Because I've been to a few political rallies organized by, say, the DPP. And typically they would bus in their supporters, and the front chunk would just be lots of people who are the hardcore supporters. They're there to cheer on no matter what the speakers are saying. But for here, it felt more self-organized, and I didn't see any signs that were the same. There was lots of handwritten signs. There was stuff that was printed out clearly by one person. There was memes. I even saw AI art of the KMT speaker. And that had me thinking, this is probably the first protest where I've seen AI art used as one of the posters. And there was lots of pride flags. There was lots of, I even saw ROC flags. I saw the anti-nuclear group also out. And to me, it felt very interesting to see all these civil society groups on one spot.
So you're saying that it seems like it's more of a grassroots movement, you're saying then. It's actually really coming from the people. It's not like some political party or organization organizing people and, like you said, busing them there or something.
Yeah, it felt very self-mobilized. And from what I read online, a lot of it is being done through obscure apps like Threads, which is kind of like the Instagram version of Twitter. And I think it's because people are worried about organizing on Twitter. Sorry, X, formerly known as Twitter. And people are just concerned about being read, so they're organizing also on Threads. So when I saw that many people on Friday, it was like the biggest rally I've seen, definitely bigger than the big DPP rally I went to in the final days of the election earlier this year. It was much bigger than that. And the ages were still pretty young, but it felt more, a lot more middle-aged people out. People older than me, but I didn't see many elderly people. So it felt like the opposite of a political rally.
I've heard that there is a lot of dirty tactics that were being used by legislators. For example, I read that some KMT and TPP lawmakers had stationed themselves outside of the Li Yuan on Wednesday morning so that they would prevent DPP legislators from signing in early on Friday's session, and that was because by doing that would prevent them to have the right to call for some procedural measures. And I'm wondering, Michael, since you've been observing and commenting on Taiwan's political scene for some time, this is not anything new, seeing legislators fighting in the Li Yuan, right? What do you think is the difference between what was motivating that in the past and what's motivating it now?
I don't think that there's any real difference. A lot of it is display, but you can see some real genuine anger. Both sides knew there would be a tussle. And so like people showed up in hockey helmets and bicycle helmets and stuff, armor and baseball gloves and, there's certainly that game-like aspect. But when you saw the exchange between the Lin Shu-fun and the KMT legislator, the KMT slapped her and then the Lin Shu-fun hit her with a right hook and nearly knocked her out. And you don't mess with these guys from Zhanghua. That's just not smart. But yeah, part of it was staged. But then, it's also a way that the DPP has used in the past to... Remember years ago that DPP legislator who actually ate a bill? I think he was DPP. I can't remember. Yeah. But he just swallowed the text of the bill, so it couldn't be voted on. So this kind of thing is it's normalized. I won't say normal, but it's normalized. And so you see a lot of disingenuous reporting that says, oh my God, look at this turmoil, right? Like particularly that Financial Times piece that was very poorly titled. Turmoil in Taipei. What turmoil? The protesters are out there with breastfeeding stations and childcare and Q and what do you call those scan things, Zeb?
Yeah, they had QR codes on their posters so people could print out their posters if they wanted to. I thought that was really cute.
Yeah, they're very organized.
Yeah, isn't that great? So it was like this peaceful protest. It was a big one, but it was totally peaceful. And the violence in the legislature is actually part of our normal process. So there's no turmoil. The turmoil is going to happen when the KMT begins initiating chaos in the function of the government once this bill passes, which I think many of us expect at some point soon in the future.
The topic of the president's power and whether or not the legislative yuan could be dismissed came up.
I did a bit of research just now, and the president can dismiss the legislature, but only if the legislature dismisses his premier. And obviously they would never do that. Yeah, they would never do that because if you're the TPP and you have suddenly a new election coming up, you're kind of screwed because there's no presidential ticket to boost your numbers. And by this time, people aren't super happy with the TPP. And they would definitely lose probably a few more seats. And if they just organize elections, say, in June. That's why they would never vote out the premier, because they can't risk that. They would rather the premier just take the brunt of the damage, I guess, for politics.
Well, that's the premier's job. The premier is never popular.
Yeah, exactly. Especially the first cabinet.
Yeah, that's a suicide squad. They'll all be gone in a year anyway. So why would you make any major sacrifice for them?
It's because they're trying to make, in 1997, they passed that constitutional amendment to try to make Taiwan go towards a more semi-presidential system, but they didn't really finish it. That's why we still have this weird system where the president can't veto, but the president can appoint a premier to talk with the legislature. It's just like a leftover.
The ROC was never meant to be a democracy. So, this is part of an evolving program here that's been going on for 30 years. It was meant to be run as a one-party state, and the Constitution was just a candy coating over the brutality and savagery of the old KMT state. But there's another thing about this set of bills that I want to talk about, if you don't mind, Felicia. And that is there's another bill in there that's the highway and infrastructure programs for the East Coast. And that calls for a highway to be built from Taichung over to the Rift Valley through the mountains, a 4-lane, a genuine highway. But right now, there's a couple of 2 lanes that do that there, but they're constantly getting knocked out because of landslides. The next thing it calls for is a 4-lane down the Rift Valley along the river there. And that would be an absolute disaster environmentally. So would the road through the mountains. And the third thing it calls for is the HSR being extended around the island. The ostensible reason for this is tourism, right? And of course, there's a lot of patronage money to be had in a highway program that's bigger than the defense budget. $61 billion, I think it is, in US dollars. It's over 2 trillion Taiwan dollars. And that's without the inevitable cost overruns and delays that will set in. The purpose of this, I've argued in a couple of columns, is to crowd out defense spending and crowd out the ability of the DPP to develop funding for its own social programs, and its own infrastructure programs. Oh, and another aspect of this, they've exempted it from the Public Debt Act. So it's not under the debt laws that govern how much debt the government can take on. This is one reason why the Taiwan government is relatively solvent, is because the amount of debt it can take on is limited. And now this highway program is exempt from that. So God knows what will happen with it. So it's being promoted by the KMT and by the oft called King of Hualien, Fu Kun-chi, who was the Hualien magistrate and the legislator from there. He was head of the defense committee at one point. So I'm sure he can see how this much spending would force the government to keep defense spending down in order to fund this program. So, Sebastian, did you see any comments about that in the protest?
I did see a couple posters that were talking about the 2 trillion NT estimate. And a lot of them were blaming, of course, the Hualien kingpin, if you will. And they had mentions about him and the spending, like, where's our taxpayer money going to? But I don't think people have really understood the connection between the defense.
That's interesting. So people haven't put together the impact of the bill for that highway and the HSR, how it's going to possibly impact defense spending. And so the public is not really aware of that, you think?
Not really super focused on it. From my understanding, I don't think the bill made it into the reading for May, the second reading. I don't think it's in the second reading. But there was a new thing they added with the Recall Act, where they changed this slightly so it would be harder to recall your officials. You need a higher threshold percentage.
Oh, wow, really?
Yeah, and as you can see, that would affect much of the recall for the entire island, since you can currently do that. But a lot of people argue that it's too easy to recall politicians. All you need is 10% of the voters in that district. But the new modified act would make it harder. You would need the amount of people that threw out Hangul and Kaohsiung in 2020. So that kind of mobilization is pretty difficult to get out in a non-election year.
Right. So what's the feeling about that? Do you think people are opposed to that?
I think people want things to be status quo. They don't like the idea of reform.
Change.
Yeah. Especially since it's pretty vague and none of the bills were given out until the last second. And I still can't find any contents on some of the bill itself. I would just see snippets posted here and there, but I'm like, where's the entire thing? I want to read it.
Another issue, I don't know, is this required that bills that are being reviewed are posted somewhere publicly? And has there been a precedent that they are posted in Taiwan?
Usually they're posted online on the Li Fa-Yen website. They have a portal where you can access all the latest bills.
Okay.
But in this case, they keep changing it, so you don't really know what's in it. And they haven't done a line-by-line reading of the bill itself. So some of the legislators don't even know what's in it. And that's kind of, as my dad said earlier, one of the KMT people told the international reporters during their press conference on Thursday that when we pass it, then we can tell you what's in it, which I find kind of absurd. If they really if they really trusted the bill, they would just review it, right? For a month. It doesn't matter, If they really were confident about it, the fact that the TPP and the KMT are trying to push this very quickly strikes me as very odd behavior.
I mean, it has to make you wonder, why did what happened 10 years ago with the sunflower movement happen, and have they learned anything? Has there been anything proposed or any reform in terms of the procedure of how bills are reviewed? Like, did they realize that, this is what led to the sunflower movement, and so they need to actually make a procedure so that there is a line-by-line review and so on, and apparently there hasn't. So I guess this is a consequence of not learning from what happened 10 years ago.
Well, yeah, I think that's part of it. And the other part is the KMT wants to get this done, because the longer it lingers, the worse it's going to be for them. And I think one of the things I noticed, Zeb, did you notice this? How so much of the protest anger was directed at Huang Guoqiang, who was a huge name from the sunflower era and has now basically switched sides?
Yeah, there was a ton of posters about him. And I saw some crude posters about him as well.
That foreign woman whose sign you had taken a picture of, Jenna Lynn Cody, she runs a wonderful blog called Lao Rencha. And she's wonderfully sarcastic and whatnot. And she reported that she saw a hopscotch thing with his face so that you could bounce on his face. I think there's a real sense of betrayal there among the activists towards him. He had been part of the NPP, the New Power Party, before that party fell apart, and he got out before it fell apart. And he switched to the TPP, which is Ko Wen-je's party, the Taiwan People's Party. And that party decided to ally itself with the KMT rather than playing some kind of broker or balancing role. Or there were innumerable ways it could have handled it, because the DPP and the KMT have pretty close to the same number of legislators. So if the TPP goes with one side or the other side, that side always wins. And there's no reason that the TPP could not have chosen to broker or some other role, but they didn't. And apparently, Courtney Donovan Smith was telling me that Ko's plan is to have the current people serving as all of his legislators are at-large legislators. So they were elected based on the amount of votes the party got. And they're going to be in office 2 years. Ko Wen-je's plan is to keep them in office 2 years, have them all mass retire, and then bring in another set so that these names will become, out in front of the public, right? So that they'll get some name recognition, some familiarity for future elections. So issue is that instead of showing themselves to be a third way or a neutral party or whatever, they have decided to ally in every vote so far with the KMT, except when they don't show up to vote. So it's perceived by the people who supported Huang when he was in the NPP and when he was, coming to prominence with the sunflowers, that he's betrayed their principles.
Let's talk about these bills, especially the ones how legislators could call people in to testify and then the non-question answer, and even allow lawmakers to fine or jail people for giving false testimony. But I wanted to make the connection a little bit more clear on how that is bad in terms of how China could have some interference in Taiwan's democracy, and how China might have some kind of power to investigate the legislative yuan and also get access to some critical information that's only revealed through the legislator.
Well, the bill does say that the committee can decide to protect classified information. But that just begs the question of what the committee is going to see as classified and what kind of decision it's going to make, right? So the committee chair can make that determination, which is now controlled by the KMT. So you can imagine they call up someone and they start asking about, say, the submarine program. And KMT legislators already have a track record of leaking information about this. So you can see where they could bring someone, even bring someone in and ask them something innocuous. Is Captain Chun assigned to the missile command? Because that would be interesting, for Beijing would like to know who's running what, right? Or the way that, or they could ask about money flows to foreign governments. That was one of the things that tripped up Chen Shui-bian, right? And they could ask about things like what is being manufactured in defense factories, who are their suppliers, all these things. There's so many questions they could ask: where weapons are being positioned, what the plan is. They could even ask about unclassified stuff that would enable people watching to infer quite a bit about what's going on. So there's a lot of games that could be played. They could haul in the transportation minister to ask about port hardening, for example, for, against bombings. They could haul in anyone, including ordinary people, foreigners. Anyone could be hauled in there at any time for any reason. And they would have to testify about something. They could probably ask you to incriminate yourself. They could pull you in and said, have you ever had an affair on your wife? Have you ever done drugs, right? Have you ever sped on the highway? You could see all the questions that you could possibly answer, right? I mean, there's nothing to stop them from going on fishing expeditions. And that would be, for ordinary people, that would just be painful and embarrassing. But for a government official, that would be blackmail material.
And now for a short break. We're currently working on bringing Talking Taiwan to the 53rd Annual Taiwanese American Conference that will be held at Westchester University in Pennsylvania, July 3rd to 7th. This year's impressive list of conference speakers include Taiwan's former Vice President, Dr. Chen Jianren, and Freddie Lim, activist, politician, and lead singer of the heavy metal band Tectonic. We will be creating an on-location podcasting studio where we will interview several of the speakers at TAC and editing them into episodes of Talking Taiwan. We'll also be interviewing past TAC organizers for a special episode of Talking Taiwan about the history and legacy of TAC. And finally, while we're at TAC, we will create a 5-minute video montage to capture the moments throughout the conference that will be shown at the closing ceremony of the conference. To support the work that Talking Taiwan will be doing at TAC, you can make a contribution to our GoFundMe campaign, or through PayPal or Zelle using our email address talkingtaiwanpodcast@gmail.com. For more details on how to donate, visit talkingtaiwan.com/support. Our current fundraising goal is $3,000. It's thanks to listeners like you that make what we do possible. Now, back to the episode. Michael also brought up the question about whether witnesses subpoenaed by the legislative yuan would be given lawyers.
Another issue for a civil society is that the people who were subpoenaed, the KMT has said too, that it won't let them have lawyers. And that came up again today. Someone who's sitting in front of a subpoena needs to have a lawyer with them, right? To make sure all the procedures are followed and to we shouldn't even have to explain that. But the KMT Fukun Chi said specifically that they shouldn't have a lawyer because they're not criminal defendants, they're witnesses. So in other words, you'll be facing that as a subpoenaed person, you would be facing that committee without legal advice and support, according to the way the bill is currently set up. And that was an issue for the civil society organizations.
Okay, yeah, that's dangerous.
There's one more thing that we didn't discuss in the bill. They added the thing where the president of Taiwan would have to do like a yearly State of the Union, and he would have to answer questions and answer session, and I thought that was kind of cartoonishly weird.
It's cartoonishly unconstitutional, one of the experts said.
The president's not supposed to be doing that. He's supposed to be in a separate branch. The premier does that for him. That's the whole purpose of the premier.
Lai has said he's willing to do that. It's the questioning that's the part that's not constitutional, right? There's nothing wrong with Lai standing there giving a State of the Union address. He's down for that. But you can imagine that if the president is there, what kind of questions they might ask him. What kind of fun could they have? The problem is that you'd have to believe, to argue for this bill, you would have to believe that the KMT is going to be operating in good faith. And there's nothing in the last 50 years of Taiwan history that would lead you to believe.
The big problem with this bill, too, the fact that they can subpoena you, and they could tell the questionnaire disinformation, and the questionnaire would say, hey, no, that's false, but they could get fined for that if the committee voted on it. So there's no penalty on the legislators to just give out fake information about whatever grandstanding they want to do. And we already know that Li Fa-yen is already extremely powerful in terms of branches compared with the executive yuan and the judicial branch. And the control yuan is completely pointless and toothless from my understanding. They're not going to add that kind of responsibility, though. They'll just give them more powers. And that's that.
Oh, wait, what do you mean add what responsibility?
Because they can question, they can subpoena, but there's no added responsibility. There's no downside of them.
There's no accountability on the part of the legislators, right?
Yeah, and it's absurd. If you're going to increase their powers, you should add some sort of counterweight to that.
Yes, right. There needs to be some check and balance around. How would you say that the protests that you've seen happening around the Li Yuan compared to what we saw during the Sunflower Movement?
Good question. I think it feels, well, definitely a lot less black. Everyone was just dressed in their daily clothes. I felt like people just got off work and just walked into the protests. Nobody changed into black shirts like the Sunflower Movement. The only Sunflower Movement rally I was at was the big one on March 30th in 2014, which was 10 years ago. Wow. And that one felt very, very driven. You could tell it was a movement. But this one just felt like dissatisfaction with the bill, just from people who just walked out the street. I saw people pushing their dogs in strollers, and they had slogans on those dogs. They had rainbow flags that were saying stuff like "Protect Taiwan." The speakers for the protest on Friday and on Tuesday are all from NGOs, from civil society, who are all warning about this bill. And if all these NGOs and civil society organizations can come together in one spot and advocate for, hey, we need to check this bill a little closely, then, yeah, there's a lot of public that don't want the bill to be rushed. You know, let's do this properly. Let's look at the contents. Why are we pushing this so quickly? I mean, there's 4 more years of your term. It's not going to end overnight. What's the harm with waiting a month to look at it?
I should add that Lai has no veto power, per se. So he can just, the cabinet can delay handing it up to the president, but eventually he's going to have to sign it. So I think the plan now is to submit it to constitutional review once it's passed.
Right. They could actually take it to court if they want to argue that some of these bills are unconstitutional. Yeah, that'd be interesting. Could you comment on what you think this means in terms of Taiwan's democracy or democratic process? What do you think is the impact if these bills get passed?
Seb, you want to take that?
Well, it feels like the next 4 years are going to be like, if they pass this bill, which they probably will, it feels like will be a rerun of the first 4 years of the Chen Shui-bian administration, where the KMT are going to frame Lai's admin as, you know, you guys are causing chaos, this is your fault, and that's going to be their job because they need to distract Lai as much as possible so they can win the next election and tie them down with all sorts of petty fighting here and there, because he's already seen what happened with Chen Shui-bian, so he has an idea what to expect. So he's probably going to copy Tsai's playbook, where he stays above the fray and hope that Taiwan's democracy prevails in that regard. And since the Constitutional Court, as my dad mentioned, they will probably take it there, it is mostly members now submitted by Tsai. And ironically, that was because the KMT refused to confirm anyone during Chen Shui-bian's era. So now the members are all basically appointed by Tsai. And they'll probably see that it's unconstitutional, like some of the aspects. But I don't know how clear it is. Like, can they throw out the whole bill, or are they just going to throw out parts of it? We don't know. But I do have faith that Taiwan's democracy will prevail, because, as we saw on Friday, that people pay attention quite closely. Everyone's discussing this bill on Twitter, on Facebook, on Threads, and they will follow this very closely, I think.
Yeah, but I mean, can the public really apply any pressure? I mean, and are the legislators going to be impacted by that? Are they really going to take this sentiment from the public seriously?
I mean, that's probably why they're doing it now, right? The next election is not until 2020. And, of course, there could be the 2026 midterm election, but I don't know if anyone will remember this by then. That's another reason why. But I think the key factor is that this kind of protest was able to show up. After 8 years of Tsai's admin, we didn't see anything on this scale. And then suddenly we have this big, massive protest outside the Li Yuan, just days after Lai was inaugurated. So it shows that, yeah, the civil society, the power of it is still quite strong. It's there.
Yeah, it actually shows that people are paying attention, that they care. That's actually pretty amazing to see also.
Let me make a couple of comments here. You asked me earlier, I hadn't even bothered to compare the two bills because that's a gotcha game. Look, even if it's exactly word for word, the same two bills between the DPP and the KMT, that's not important. The issue is, how will this power be used? The issue for me is, democracy-wise, is that we have a little window here. There's the threat from China that we have to think about. And we have this window here where the government needs to act. And it needs to act on so many issues that affect Taiwan's democracy, such as stagnant wages, rising housing prices, discontent among the young, the need for care for all our growing elderly, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There's so many things that have to be acted on that they will not be acted on because the KMT can tie down the legislature now for years with absurd subpoena requests. And then they can say, like when the U.S. says, well, why aren't you getting more weapons? And they can say, well, we've got this investigation of DPP corruption to take care of. So the way I see the threat to democracy here is that it will continue this strange drift towards rightwardness. So many young men voted for Ko Wen-je's TPP, right? And I was pretty heartened to see a lot of young men out at the protests the other day because I suspect a lot of people are now feeling very betrayed. And that will show up at the polls in 4 years. I don't think the public does have short memories, but if Ko Wen-je continues aligning the TPP with the KMT, they will see that every day. So for me, the issue is that the things that need to be fixed won't get fixed, and the defense things that need to be done won't get done. So that's, for me, the worry, the threat to democracy that I see.
Any other thoughts about what you've seen or we haven't talked about?
The protest had a lot of high schoolers, as I mentioned, and these kids can't vote until they're 20. Yeah. So they feel like their future's being voted on, and they have no say in it. That's why they're showing up at the protests.
Interesting. Lowering
the voting age was something that both parties supported, but somehow didn't get done. So it's like the whole legislature is like a black box. Stuff goes in, but it doesn't come out. It's a problem for Taiwan's democracy.
So how could the legislative yuan be reformed then? Is there any mechanism that could reform?
Well, that goes back to... yes, actually there is. There used to be, you need to get rid of the first past the post vote, and it needs to become some kind of proportional representation like it used to be. When the DPP and the KMT made that reform of the legislature, they reduced the size of the legislature. And at that time, a lot of legislators, including Wang Qingping, who was the big KMT head of the Taiwanese legislators in the KMT, Wang Qingping complained, how can we get anything done? We have all this stuff to take care of. And we got to have people to fill committees. We got to have people to go home and, check out their constituents and service their demands. We don't have enough people for that. And that's been a problem with the legislature because there's certain committees, like if you serve on defense, well, what constituents are helped by that, right? So a lot of those go to at-large legislators. They don't go to legislators who represent districts. So this hurt the small parties, which was, I think, its intention by both of the major parties. They sort of cooperated to strangle the smaller parties. And that was a really bad move for Taiwan's democracy. It would have been much better if we kept the proportional representation with all those crazy guys running for legislative spots with insane ads and, noise and color and all kind of good stuff. Those elections were great in the 90s. But seriously, proportional representation would be better. That large legislators are useful because they can fulfill committee roles that legislators representing districts can't. But the issue is that there just aren't enough legislators. The legislature is too small. And the biggest reform that you could do would be to double or triple its size. So I think Courtney Donovan-Smith actually has a piece on this from a couple of years ago, but I can't remember. He and I have talked about it many times. But for me, the best thing you could do for the legislature would be to triple it in size, so that there's enough legislators to carry out all of its tasks.
They're going to be doing the third reading today. There'll be a final protest about it, but right now it's pouring in Taipei, so I'm not sure how many people will show up.
But it's pouring everywhere. And that's the other thing that we should mention is that it's not just Taipei where these protests are taking place. It's all over the country.
So have there been any protests in Taichung?
Of course. But I didn't visit. Unfortunately, I worked during the day, so I couldn't go down. But, they're all over. And this is a nationwide thing, and it's spontaneous. That's what makes it so great. Yeah.
And global, actually.
Oh, that's right. There's protests in other places as well. So a lot of people understand the issue and the problems that we're going to be facing if the KMT is given these powers.
I also spoke with Sean Su after the third reading of amendments to the law governing the legislature's power and the bills passed on Tuesday, May 28th.
The third reading passed, so essentially now a lot of time has passed, but now it's up to President Lai Ching-te of the DPP to sign the bill. What he can do is he could send it back to the legislature, but what will just happen is the legislature will just, with their simple majority of the KMT and the TPP, will just simply vote to approve the bill, at which point Lai Ching-te, he doesn't have a veto power. He will have to either sign it or, try to contest the constitutionality of it. So essentially that's what's going to happen. However, testing the constitutional court like this time and again is quite dangerous. Democracy, again, requires vigilance, and testing its safeties is really alarming. And to make matters worse, Fu Kunqi and Han Kuo-yu, these are the legislators. Fu Kunqi is technically independent, but for all intents and purposes, he is part of the KMT. And this guy has been sentenced to 7 years in prison for corruption. And Han Kuo-yu, I believe, was convicted of insider trading. Fu Kunqi was in jail. I don't think he served all 7 years, but they call him the King of Hualien. He basically rules Hualien County in a way, and I have so many stories, too long for this podcast. But yes, he is essentially, for all intents and purposes, despite Taiwan being a democracy, the king of Hualien. And he acts more like a king there than anything else. His wife, of course, runs Hualien now, but he was running Hualien from prison for a while. It was really bizarre and embarrassing. This guy is saying, I'm going to use this bill essentially in a retaliatory or vengeful way to root out corruption in the DPP, the opposition party.
Yeah, so can you talk about the bill that just got passed?
Sure. The problem with this recent bill for legislative reform is I do believe the legislature should have the right to get like a State of the Union. I do believe that the legislator should have the right to summon people for, you can ask them questions just like the US government has, right? That's fair. What I don't think is fair about this bill is having the ability to judge what is right or wrong by simple majority. Let's put it this way. There's a lot of governments where the legislature could be prone to conspiracy. Here's an example. A good number or the majority of the KMT believes in a conspiracy theory that former President Chen Shui-bian in 2004 hired somebody to shoot himself so he would get sympathy votes to win that election. I believe there might be one or two or a couple of people that did have sympathy to vote for the other side. I don't know. If you're a big Biden supporter and maybe there was an assassination attempt against Trump, maybe you might vote for Trump out of sympathy. I don't know. But that was the claim. Unfortunately, the KMT hired some world-class investigators, and those investigators said it was an authentic assassination attempt, poorly made, albeit by amateurs, but it was real. Mm-hmm. And so even their own people that they hired couldn't corroborate this. Mm-hmm. Now, here's the thing. Okay. What if the KMT, they drag somebody to the legislative yuan, maybe President Lai Ching-te, and they say, okay, is this conspiracy real or false? And Lai, of course, says, no. Even the people you hired said it wasn't real. And they'll say, well, no, that's not the truth. We're going to fine you 200,000 NTD. Go fight it out in court. Oh, and we think every word you said in response was a lie, so we're just going to stack them up at you. Another 200,000 NT here, 200,000 NT there, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
But so they get to decide what's the truth or not just by a majority vote?
Yes, and they also get to decide how much penalty there should be. That's overreaching government. And not to mention, these are duties by the control yuan to investigate corruption and what have you. And then, part of it, and of course the fine and what have you. But they do basically procedure. But it's basically two other branches of government, the investigative yuan and the control yuan, being stepped on. But, a proper democracy needs separation of powers. They shouldn't overlap. Mm-hmm. Imagine you can't let the legislative yuan become judge, jury, and executioner by simple majority. Same way we don't let our president become judge, jury, and executioner. That would be wrong. Imagine that, right? You vote for someone for president, it's actually a temporary tyrant, and he just pulls you in, asks you, what color is the sky? And you say, well, today it's raining. He's like, you're wrong. It is fluorescent yellow. You've lied. I fine you 200,000 NT. Go to court or potentially prison.
So arbitrary.
It is arbitrary.
So what you're saying is that Fu is saying he's going to put together some kind of a corruption committee or task force to root out this corruption.
Ironic, yeah. Other concerns are that because the legislative yuan can request documents, these legislators can literally go to any CEO in Taiwan or anybody they deem of interest and say, okay, I want you to hand over inside corporate info. These are people who have been convicted of crimes in the legislature demanding to use these newfound powers that they suddenly have. It's ripe for abuse.
And if they summon somebody and somebody has to say something on the record, is that also available to the public, that the public will know what this person has said when they're questioned?
I believe the inquiry will be public, but the problem is it's not going to change anything because, again, they vote for everything via legislative majority. So this causes issues here and there. To keep things short, in 2012, the DPP also tried to propose a reform bill, right? Because they were the opposition party. There are people who say propaganda that said, oh, the DPP were for it until they were against it. Or it's the same bill from 2012. But that's demonstrably false. The one in 2012 does not have overreaching powers of penalizing people, potentially, resulting in them potentially serving jail time if they refuse. There's a lot of problems with the bill because it's too vague. Apparently, the legislature might even possibly be able to deny somebody a legal presence. But just putting that aside, you have to answer. Unlike the United States, you can't plead the fifth. You could easily perjure yourself. And again, they determine the truth by simple majority. I feel this is a huge mistake because the KMT and the TPP, the Taiwan People's Party, should consider that one day they may not have majority in the legislature. And they themselves could, start a trend where they get persecuted down the line. Again, democracy is always a struggle. It requires constant vigilance. And so people are doing the best. I do feel that this year's protest is very similar from 10 years ago. Things have modernized a bit. People are now holding glowing signs and stuff. But otherwise, it's much the same. It's very professional. People are very peaceful. They are organized. And I think that's also awesome, too. And there were so many platforms this year where people are talking and stuff to explain what's wrong with this bill. Corruption does happen in democracies. There does need to be a sort of inquiry and task force against corruption. But again, we literally do have two branches that are doing it, and they've only been getting more and more effective, and they've been getting better at it. So all of a sudden, corrupt leaders in the legislature in Taiwan suddenly decide that they need a new bill so they can be judge, jury, and executioner is completely different from what people wanted in 2012. Interestingly, recent polls that even showed that a good chunk, I think approaching almost half of DPP also feel that there needs to be such a bill, not only such a bill, like similar to this bill, but the process and the way they've executed it. They tried to put secret amendments before the second reading, making it hard for the DPP to counter. All these things, it's really wrong. And again, a good democracy requires good faith actors. And having bad faith actors is really dangerous for any democracy, even a strong one.
It seems that there's not much can be done because the KMT and the TPP decided to align with the KMT to give them a majority. I don't see how they're going to be able to get out of this unless, as you say, it goes to the Constitutional Court. But we don't know what the ruling is going to be.
Yeah, we don't know, and that's where the danger lies. That said, of course, it will absolutely go to the Constitutional Court. And the Cross-Strait Services Trade Agreement Bill 10 years ago didn't exactly have that luxury other than being very black box.
The Cross-Strait Services Trade Agreement Bill that Sean is referring to is the one that led students and activists to occupy the Legislative Yuan 10 years ago in what came to be known as the Sunflower Movement.
But this time they did a lot of things like initially collecting people's votes by hand raising. So we didn't know who voted for what. But by the third reading, they did promise to calculate by people voting on electronic voting on their seats. So they knew who voted for it, who didn't. But that still doesn't help because, again, this bill, I believe, is very unconstitutional. And we'll see what happens in the coming days and weeks as this process continues. But yeah, there is definitely a lot of echoes from 10 years ago. I do believe there needs to be a law that requires line-by-line reading publicly, as well as line-by-line reading and amendments. It might make things a tad slower, but it's worth it, That's the purpose of government. They're supposed to work for us, not the other way around. The courts are the jury and the executioner. It should never be the legislature, especially not truth by simple majority in the legislature.
I've been speaking with Michael Turton and his son Sebastian about what led up to the protests surrounding Taiwan's Legislative Yuan after fights broke out in the legislative chambers on May 17th. We will share links to Michael Turton's Taipei Times columns that were mentioned in this episode on our website, talkingtaiwan.com. I also spoke with Sean Su after several controversial bills were passed on May 28th. Stay tuned for a more in-depth interview with Sean about his participation in the occupation of the legislative yuan 10 years ago during the Sunflower Movement. Now it's time for you to show us some love. Rate us on Spotify, or if you're listening on Apple Podcasts or Audible, leave us a review there. It helps others to discover Talking Taiwan. To learn more about any of the items mentioned in this episode, visit our website, talkingtaiwan.com. There we'll list any related links. Thank you for listening to another episode of Talking Taiwan. I'm your host, Felicia Lin.
Talking Taiwan is brought to you by Forumosa.com.